Okay, welcome everybody to today's Basis Technologies webinar. Thanks for joining us here in this latest in our series of webinars on DevOps and test automation for SAP. As always with these sessions, just a little bit of webinar admin before we get into the main topic, which, as you can see on the screen, is today a step-by-step guide to CI/CD workflows in SAP. And we're going to look at particularly what those kind of workflows can look like in SAP environments. So everybody on the call will see that you're on mute today, as is usual on these webinars. But if you do have any questions you'd like to ask as we go through the session, we would encourage you to enter those into the questions box on the GoToWebinar control panel that you should see there. And we'll get to some of those at the end as time allows. We're going to aim to run for about 45 minutes today. And as always, this is a recorded session. So we will be sharing a link to the recording to everybody who's registered when the event has finished. You'll probably see that in a day or two. So if you do want that link to the recording and you don't see it for any reason, do please let us know and we will obviously sort that out for you. We do seem to have one or two people struggling with audio, but I think it's working for most of you. So we'll move on and hopefully they'll be able to sort that out. Okay, so yes. Today's presenter is a very important person on the screen there, and one slightly less so. My name is Peter Yabsley. I'm the head of product marketing here at Basis Technologies. If any of you have joined our webinars before, you may have seen me, may have heard my voice. But the most important person in today's session is also on the screen with me here, and that's James Barter, one of our solution directors here at Basis Technologies and a very experienced hand in the SAP world. James, thank you for joining us here in this lovely day in the UK.
Great to be here.
So James is going to take us through the main part of today's presentation. So we'll talk about that in a second. Let's have a look at the agenda and just have a quick skim through what we're going to go through in today's webinar. So first of all, we're going to touch on, just to set the scene and make sure we all have the same understanding, what is CI/CD? What do we mean by CI/CD, and particularly in an SAP environment? And then the main section of the webinar, James is going to take us through a step-by-step example of the life of a change in a CI/CD process within an SAP landscape and what that can look like. We're also going to talk a bit about connecting SAP to wider tool chains for a more integrated CI/CD process, which is a very important topic around this kind of subject. And then finally, we'll finish off with a quick real-world example of a Basis Technologies customer that is working in a more CI/CD and automated way. Before we begin the main content, a very quick look, as always, just at Basis Technologies for anyone on the call who may not be so familiar with us as a company and why we're here today talking about CI/CD and why we're talking about topics like DevOps in general. So we create software automation that helps our customers to change the way they run SAP systems. And we do that by enabling them to adopt approaches like DevOps and CI/CD within SAP, which is perhaps less traditionally done than in other parts of IT. So we have the most complete DevOps and test automation platform that is specifically engineered for SAP, and that's really the crucial bit from an automation point of view, which James is going to talk to us about a bit later. We've been around for a long time, more than 20 years now, founded in 1997, as you can see on the screen. We have a global presence with offices around the world in North America, Europe, and Australia. And many customers, many clients around the world, some of the world's biggest SAP users that we're helping to run their SAP systems more effectively. And you can see a few examples on the screen there. So let's get started. Let's look at what is CI/CD. As I said, let's make sure we all have the same understanding on today's call before we start talking about SAP specifically. So when we say CI/CD, we're talking about continuous integration and continuous delivery. I'm sure most, if not all of you on the call are familiar with those terms. There are other continuous terms that we might also hear when we're talking around this topic, and I'll touch on a couple in a minute, but CI/CD is really the heart of the matter when it comes to this topic of software automation and delivering faster, which, as you can see in the second bubble there, is the core of this CI/CD concept. It's about building an automated software delivery pipeline that helps you to deliver software faster and with more confidence. So we're talking about quite extensive automation typically here when we talk CI/CD, particularly outside of SAP. So in other applications, this may be really a fully automated pipeline that might be driven by somebody using a code repository based on Git. It's very common with independent developers who are submitting, merging their work back into a main repository. And as soon as they do that, that's kicking off a chain of automated actions that can build environments, can run automated tests, can potentially even deploy those changes all the way through to production environments, potentially without human intervention. And if we think about things like the famous examples of the Amazons or Facebooks of the world, where they're changing web interfaces in particular hundreds, maybe even thousands of times per day, this is the kind of way they're working. A developer signaling they're finished is triggering a whole automated continuous integration and delivery workflow. And finally, as it says on the screen there, you're going to see the terms CI/CD and DevOps going hand in hand very often. They're not the same. DevOps does have more of a cultural element and perhaps a broader approach, but the outcomes that we're talking about with DevOps and CI/CD are very much aligned, so we do tend to see those commonly going together. And as you can see on the screen here, James has kind of leapt ahead of me because he's so eager to get to these fabulous bits of data, but these are the kind of reasons why people are looking at CI/CD and DevOps and why we're talking about these different ways of developing and delivering software. So these are some stats from the DORA State of DevOps report that was run in 2009, which was the last one they published before they were bought by Google. And when they surveyed the IT community, the group that they defined as elite performers, the people more likely to be doing things like CI/CD and DevOps, we're seeing these kind of outcomes that are on the screen there. You know, they were delivering much more code, much more quickly, with many fewer problems. And if they did have issues, they were able to resolve those things much more quickly and easily. And it's things like automation and CI/CD that are often helping those high-performing organizations to do this kind of thing. So if we just get back to the kind of, let's say, specifics around CI/CD for a moment, what we can see on the slide here is maybe a typical software development lifecycle, the kind of thing in a DevOps world we would see very often represented as that figure of 8 type of diagram to imply this continuous process, this iterative process of software delivery. But just to be clear on the definition of these terms that we're talking about, as you can see with CI, with continuous integration, we're really talking about this part from code to merge or commit, and that's the step that I mentioned where we're putting new code back into a central code repository. The coding part in here probably isn't going to be automatic these days. Maybe we're getting towards that, but much of the rest of this process will, as I've mentioned. So as soon as the code's ready, typically triggered by an automatic flag like a commit into a version control system, there will be unit tests, there will be automatic builds of environments that are needed for testing. Those tests will happen automatically, etc., etc. Maybe more, maybe less obvious is this idea of continuous delivery. And what we really mean by that is the ability to deploy any change as soon as it's ready, as soon as you want to, so that you can get value from that as quickly as possible. So your trigger for that could be a particular date. It could be the end of a 2-week DevOps sprint. It could be as soon as a manual approval has gone in. But the key thing here is what we're saying by continuous delivery is not that we're pushing every change into production automatically. It's that we're able to as soon as we want to, as soon as it's ready, and we have the confidence through automated testing and the rest of the process that we can do that safely. But that said, as I mentioned, you might hear a couple of other continuous terms. I think it's worth just touching on those in the context of today's conversation. But one of those is continuous testing, which is often used because testing is such an important part of a CI/CD process in many instances. And certainly automation is something that a lot of firms are looking at in that area, but it really fits into that continuous integration part of the process. And then we do have another CD, which is a little bit confusing. It's not so often referred to as CD, but it's this term continuous deployment, which is that idea of if you really want to, and you've really got a process that you can trust with a level of automation you have confidence in, you can deploy, you can have the capability to deploy changes automatically into your live production systems, so that you have no delay in actually getting value from the work that's been done. Much less common, particularly environments like SAP for obvious reasons. So when we say CD, we're typically talking about this idea of continuous delivery, not continuous deployment. So then finally, if we just take a quick look at what that might look like outside of SAP, just to get a sense in terms of what automation we're looking at. This is a basic example of a possible CICD tool chain and where those tools might be used at the different stages of the process. They may well be used more than once at many different stages as well. But just to give the sense of this best of breed tool chain, doing lots of different automated functions, communicating with each other, probably via APIs, to give this fully automated process or highly automated process in a CICD context. So that brings us to, that kind of sets the scene, as I said, and that brings us to the subject of SAP. And this is really where I want to bring James and his expertise into the conversation, because I've touched on that very, very high level, very fast introduction to CICD, James, but how does that relate to where we stand with SAP today, and particularly those core systems like ECC and S4 that a lot of our audience might be concerned with?
Well, I think, as you can see from this slide on the screen at the moment, there's a bit of a chasm between the way the rest of the world works and the way the SAP world works. And of course, as you've mentioned, there's a whole host of tools available to help with that non-SAP world. It tends to be a lot of distributed development, Git-based development, so lots of branching and all that type of stuff. And then on the other hand, on the other side of that chasm, as we see, we have SAP. And really, this is I suppose, an architectural difference between the way SAP systems are set up and the way the non-SAP world tends to work. So we normally are all sharing the same development systems. So we're all changing the same code base at the same time, which gives us certain problems around different versions of objects as that's going through that development and deployment process. We use the good old SAP transport management system to manage those technical changes, those transports through the landscape. So it's just a different way of working, really, than the rest of the IT world tends to work. So of course that brings its own sort of sets of problems with it.
Okay, so we've got that kind of situation where SAP is a bit different, not uncommon, to be honest, I think in some ways. And we've got a slightly different visualization here with a few more specifics. What's this slide showing us in terms of the idea of CICD and SAP?
Well, I think it's worth just starting off with this type of view, because I think this is a sort of landscape setup that the vast majority of the people that are with us today will understand and have within their own organization. So, in a development in an SAP landscape, we tend to start off with a development system, followed by a QA system, followed by pre-prod, and then finally moving into the production system. So, this is where the architecture is different to those non-SAP environments. But we want to try and achieve exactly the same outcomes within our SAP landscapes as we can with our non-SAP landscapes. So when we're looking at the development system, we're looking at trying to get higher quality out of development in the first place. As we're moving into our QA environments, we need to know what actually needs to be tested, and we need to target that testing so that we can consistently test those changes and make sure we understand the scope of what that testing actually needs to be to make sure that the changes work correctly. And then as we're moving into pre-prod, we want to do our regression testing. And of course, this is a big item in the SAP world, because obviously SAP systems are very, very interconnected and they have lots of dependencies. And so we need to make sure that we're regression testing all those changes before they move to production. And then, of course, when we are moving into the production environments, we want to minimize any potential disruption to those production users when we do so. And the process here is that we want to look at automating as much of this end-to-end process in our SAP landscapes as we possibly can, so that we can then have this CI/CD process across our SAP landscapes.
Okay, great. So we're talking about automation. Yeah, automation. We're talking about automation. We're talking about minimizing those delays between the various different stages and making sure we do the right checks and testing as we go through. I'm going to hand over to you to take us through, starting with this first slide we've got on the screen here, that step-by-step journey of an example of what this kind of CI/CD process could look like and what role that automation you've talked about plays. So over to you, James, and take us through this this little journey.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we have all these tools in the non-SAP world to help us, with these types of processes. And so we need a similar thing, when we're looking at doing these processes in SAP as well. So as we can see at the sort of in the middle of the screen there, we've got something we're just going to call the SAP Change Orchestrator. Yeah, and it's this SAP Change Orchestrator which needs to orchestrate and automate this whole end-to-end requirement to deploy process, as SAP calls it. Yeah? So what we're going to do now is we're just going to go through a step-by-step process through a change being created and all of the things that a SAP Change Orchestrator really needs to be able to do to accomplish a CI/CD within our SAP landscapes. So the first thing is, of course, we have a business requirement that's created. And in lots of organizations, those business requirements are going to originate in other systems, ITSM systems, things like ServiceNow or Remedy BMC. In other organizations, they might be using more sort of modern backlog management tools like Jira or Azure DevOps or something like that. But essentially, wherever that business change or that business requirement originates, we need to make sure that's automatically pushed into our SAP Change Orchestrator, because it's the very beginning of the process. Okay, and of course, once that change has been created in our SAP Change Orchestrator, then our developers can start coding against that particular business requirement. And whether they're doing that in the SAP GUI or whether they're doing that in something like Eclipse, it's essential that as soon as they create the transports, the technical manifestation of that business change in any SAP system, that those transports are linked straight back to that business change. So we always have full visibility of work in progress and which transports are associated with which particular business requirements. And part of that coding process can be a peer review once the coding has been completed. Now, this is a step that any organization really can put in place, and we put it in place here at Basis Technologies for our own development a number of years ago. And it has a couple of really big advantages. Of course, the first advantage is you get a second set of eyes on each change once a developer has actually finished that development process, and they can pick up all those bits and pieces that the original developer may not have seen, and so we're going to get better quality out of the development team just by putting in a peer review process. The other thing about a peer review process is it spreads knowledge across the development teams as well. Because you've got a second set of eyes on each development that's being done, then that does spread the knowledge across, which makes it easier in the long run to maintain these developments as you go forward. And of course, no sort of development process is complete really until we can automate the unit testing of the development itself. Now, interestingly enough, of course, the ABAP Workbench already has this sort of capability built into it with ABAP Unit. So we want to start being able to utilize these types of processes within our SAP development cycle. Because, of course, once we have an ABAP Unit test created, then we can automatically run that unit test at any point we want during this whole process. And we can start then automating all of that unit testing for all of our developments going forward, which of course, as we then have our maintenance cycles and we make changes to on top of these changes, that we're going to ensure we're not going to be introducing any issues. So the idea here is that those automated unit tests need to be integrated into our SAP Change Orchestrator, so we know that they're run, and they're run automatically every time a developer makes a change. And of course, it's not just about running automated tests. We want to run automated quality checks as well. So we want to be able to automatically do code quality checks, code performance checks, code security checks. Obviously, security is becoming a hotter and hotter topic in the age that we live. We need to make sure that people aren't inadvertently introducing potential security holes, or even maybe even trying to do it deliberately. But all of these types of quality checks need to be integrated and automated in this development process itself. So essentially what we're saying is the development team in a CI/CD process has to take full responsibility for the quality of everything that leaves the development system and moves into the QA system. Yeah. Now this can be a bit of a change to a lot of SAP teams because they tend to be quite siloed. The developers do their bit, they throw it over the fence to the QA team, they do their bit. But of course, that means that you start getting lots of cycles of rework between dev and QA. And that's something we want to stop. We want to stop that by ensuring that we're automating and integrating all of these quality checks into the process before any change is allowed anywhere near the QA system. And last but not least, when it comes to the responsibilities of the developers, we also need to understand the dependencies of the changes and what dependencies they may have between them, and also the impact of every change. Yeah? So obviously, as I mentioned before, we tend to work in single monolithic development systems, which quite often means that as a developer, I'm using something else another developer has created for a completely different change request, for a completely different reason possibly. But I'm now my change is now dependent on on their change, and so we need to understand that so we can orchestrate the deployment of those changes through the landscape. And of course, the other side of that is SAP being a very integrated environment. It means that we really need to understand the impact of every change as well, because I can make a change and it can have much wider impacts in the system than I'm aware of. So we need that SAP Change Orchestrator, not only to ensure that all the quality checks have been run, but also to understand automatically all the dependencies between the changes and the impacts of all those changes before we move them into the QA system. So of course, once we have got our development package here, we've quality checked it, we understand the dependencies, we understand the impacts, then it's time to release that change into the QA environment. And once again, once all of these previous steps have been completed, the SAP Change Orchestrator should be able to automatically deploy all of the relevant transports. Now, the deployment of a change into QA is not simply a matter of, emailing the basis team and saying, can you please import these transports into this QA system? Because it's important that we understand the sequencing of those transports, we understand the dependencies, as we've mentioned before, but also there are dependencies that go across our SAP systems as well. So we have to understand those dependencies. I may have a change, it may have some changes, some ECC transports, some BW transports, some CRM transports, and they all may need to be deployed across those different landscapes in the correct sequence. So this is all about the SAP Change Orchestrator being able to orchestrate the deployment of those transports across our SAP landscape. And there may be things like, manual steps, manual activities that need to happen either before or after some of those transports are imported into our QA system. So this automated deployment is not just about saying, I can log into STMS and say, press a button and import some transports. It's about orchestrating the deployment of changes across the landscape. And of course, once our change is in QA, then we're looking at testing that change. And once again, because our change orchestrator, if it understands the real impact of every change, then that gives us a really big head start. So if we're using traditional test automation tools, something like a Tosca or Worksoft, one of these types of tools, or a UFT, then of course we know what the impact of that change is, and we can pass that information over to those traditional test automation tools, so they can then execute the correct tests for that change, and then pass the results of that change back to the SAP Change Orchestrator. Obviously, if there was a problem found, the SAP Change Orchestrator can then inform the developers. If there weren't any problems found, then the SAP Change Orchestrator can then automate the deployment of that change further on in the process. And of course, the same thing works if we're doing manual testing as well. Yeah. So if we're doing manual testing, we do our manual testing, we know what the impact of that change is. Hopefully our SAP Change Orchestrator can tell us which test scripts are actually impacted by that change, so we know which ones we actually have to run. And once again, we can then tell that the orchestrator whether that testing was successful or not. And if it was successful, then it can automatically move the change further on in this process. And of course, that next step in this process is that deployment to a pre-prod environment. Now, not everyone has pre-prod environments, but most SAP organizations do. And of course, when we deploy to that pre-prod environment, once again, we need to ensure that we orchestrate that deployment correctly across our different SAP systems. We're sequencing the transports, we understand the dependencies, we understand the cross-system dependencies, so we know that that deployment is going to be successful into our pre-prod environment. And of course, a lot of organizations look to deployments to pre-prod as sort of trial cutovers, if you like, into the production system. So the same rigor has to be applied in pre-prod as it was applied in QA, as we will apply when we actually deploy those changes into our pre-prod environment. And once in pre-prod, this tends to be where our regression testing happens. Now, this may not be done for every change. It may be that we actually deploy to pre-prod at the end of a sprint or something like that. But essentially, we do need to run our regression tests here. Now, lots of organizations regression test at different levels. Yeah? Some of the organizations that I worked with do essentially next to no regression testing, not a particularly good idea. Some do high levels of regression testing. They have huge regression test packs, which they run through every time they want to do a regression test. But the thing here is, I'll go back to what I was saying earlier around SAP being a very integrated environment. Because SAP is such an integrated environment, it really does mean that we have to run really high-level regression tests with high coverage. Essentially, we want to try and test everything every time. And the only way to do that is through automation. There's no way we're going to be able to get the high levels of coverage we need unless we can fully automate our regression tests. And one of the interesting things about that is that if you can fully automate that regression test, you can essentially look at shifting it left in the process, as we can see here on the screen. So you can do your regression testing of your changes before they even hit the QA system. So this sort of then increases that responsibility of the development team once again, that not only are they doing all the automated unit testing and the quality checks and the dependency analysis and impact assessments, but also that we know that the changes that we're pushing out of the development systems don't cause any regressions before they're tested for the actual change that's been made. So that sort of advanced organizations that run these types of processes do have that ability to shift the regression testing left in the cycle like this. But of course, once we have completed our regression tests, we're then looking to approve into production. Some organizations that approval may be done in the SAP Change Orchestrator. In other organizations, it may originate in the tool where the change originated in the first place, so the ServiceNow or the Jira or the Zero DevOps, whatever it may be. And so we need to be able to integrate those tools with our SAP Change Orchestrator to understand that approval. And once that approval's been given, we're then obviously looking to deploy to our production system. Once again, of course, using exactly the same rigor as we applied when we make those deployments, when we deployed into QA and into our pre-prod environments, understanding the sequencing, the dependencies, etc., etc. Okay. The other thing here, when we're looking at CI/CD processes, is that we want to minimize any potential impact to the production system when we deploy. So lots of times you hear people talking about MTTR, mean time to recovery. Yeah, and so if we do have a failed deployment for some reason, even after all of these checks and balances we put into the process up till now, if we do have a failed deployment, we need some way of recovering quickly. So we need some way of automatically partially restoring the production system, so that we don't impact the production system. Well, we impact it as little as possible if we do have failed deployments. Having said that, of course, because of all the rigor we put into this automated process up till now, we shouldn't have very many failed deployments, and therefore you can sort of look at this, if you like, as a little bit of a sort of the ultimate insurance policy, but you do need a way to automatically recover the system in case of a failed deployment to production. And last but not least, to sort of finish the circle off, I suppose, here, we're then looking at continuously improving this whole end-to-end process. So all the way through this process, our SAP Change Orchestrator needs to be gathering the metrics and the KPIs that are required, so that after each deployment, we can then look and see, what we did well, what went well in this cycle. That's great. Give ourselves a pat on the back, but also see where we can improve the process. Where is there still waste or inefficiency in that process? I was talking about reworks into QA, for example. I mean, why is it, let's say, one of our development teams, their average rework into QA is 1.2 times, but another team, their average rework into QA is 3.4 times. What's the difference between those teams, and how do we spread that best practice across the teams? So continuous improvement is very much part of this CI/CD process, so that every time we go through one of these cycles, we get better and better at it as an organization. So that's us looking at how to orchestrate an SAP change or changes through an SAP landscape using our SAP Change Orchestrator and all the automation it can give us to help us do that. But what we find quite often these days is that that's not enough for organizations anymore. Yeah? So they have a whole host of applications that sit outside of SAP. We know that SAP is not an island, and they may already have these CI/CD processes enabled in those non-SAP applications. And we talked obviously about some of the tools that are used in some non-SAP development earlier in the webinar. So they may be using a Jenkins or a GitLab or something like that, yeah, to orchestrate those deployments. And of course, lots of changes that are made may affect some of those non-SAP applications and our SAP backend applications as well. So if I want to make a change to, I don't know, my sales order process, I may have to make some changes to my mobile app, some changes to my website, but also some changes to my SAP systems as well. And we need to be able to coordinate those changes across the different technology stacks using our orchestration tools. Yeah? So for example, it might be that I have a change which, as I say, has a mobile part to it. And once the SAP portion of the development has been completed for that, our SAP Change Orchestrator needs to be able to integrate out to whatever the CI/CD pipeline is outside of SAP and let that know. And of course, that can then say, right, once the mobile portion and the website portions are then complete, then it can issue the command to the SAP Change Orchestrator to say, now we can deploy. Yeah? And in this way, this gives us this ability to create CI/CD pipelines, enterprise-wide CI/CD pipelines across the different technology stacks, but ensure that we understand the dependencies between those different systems, and we can deploy continuously across all of them. So I've talked about a SAP Change Orchestrator and things up till now. It's probably time for me to introduce Basis Technologies' automated DevOps and testing platform for SAP. Pete mentioned it earlier in the webinar, and that platform consists of two main tools. The first one is called Active Control. That's all around the change and release and transport management automation side. Essentially, the ability to give SAP customers the ability to deliver continuously but safely into their SAP production systems. And Testimony is a revolutionary new take on automated regression testing for SAP systems, and that gives us the ability to fully automate a regression test, but without having to create any test scripts or maintain any test scripts, etc. So if I take those tools and I transpose them, if you like, on that previous circle diagram that we saw, we can see that Active Control can sit in the middle and orchestrate the deployment of change across our SAP landscapes, and then tightly integrate with things like Jenkins and GitLab, etc., and Azure DevOps, so that we can have these enterprise-wide CI/CD pipelines. And then Testimony can sit at the points where we want to run regression testing to fully automate that regression testing and allow us to achieve these automated CI/CD processes. And so together, just to, I suppose, finish off a bit, together this allows us to do our continuous integration with our automated unit tests and quality checks and dependency checks, etc., and impact assessments, so that we are increasing the quality that's coming out of our development environments. We can deliver more frequently because we can automate the testing, and then we can automate and orchestrate the actual deployments across our multiple SAP landscapes. And then not forgetting that end bit, which is making sure that we have the empirical data across this whole process, across this development and deployment process, so that we can measure our performance, identify any waste, and improve the efficiency of the overall CI/CD process.
Okay, great. Thanks, James. I remember to take myself off mute, so I feel like I'm a winner in this webinar already. But quite a lot of information there, even though that's a high-level spin around that circle. Of course, there's lots of technical detail and rigor, that we could get into various elements of that process. But I think James has given a flavor there of the kind of things we need to be thinking about to build this kind of automated delivery pipeline within SAP. And certainly we have many customers around the globe who are doing this at various different levels, whether that be automating into QA because they have a high level of confidence from all of that developer responsibility and automated testing and analysis that James has talked about, or whether it goes further through the pipeline. So what we want to do, just to wrap up, is to take a quick look at an example of that, which is one of our customers, Ericsson, which I'm sure is a company that many, if not all of you, are familiar with, very large telecommunications provider. And we've worked with Ericsson for, well, I don't know, a couple of years, at least 2 or 3 years now, I think, to help them change the way they manage change in their SAP systems. Something we've presented at events like TechEd with them also, and we have a case study on our website if any of you are interested in more details of this story. But I'm going to take a quick spin through the context and what Ericsson did with Active Control to build a more CI/CD type pipeline. So as you can see on the screen here, a bit of context. This wasn't just an SAP project at Ericsson. The move towards DevOps in their case and CI/CD as part of that was much broader across the IT team and across different applications. And the first person that we actually really engaged with, who was leading this from an Ericsson point of view, was actually a non-SAP person who was more experienced in the DevOps side of things. And you can see some of the reasons they were doing it there, very much a commercial decision to try and accelerate the way they could deliver software. Well, what they found across this program that they had planned across actually a number of years was that as they started to develop different tools, different processes, and put some tools in. James, you could just take us back for a second. As they started to put in some DevOps and CI/CD processes and implement some different tools, for the reasons we've described, and in that context that we've described, they found that those things weren't working in SAP, and actually that was starting to become a hindrance and a blocker in employing these new ways of working, because SAP, as James has explained, was a part of that process, and other applications were dependent on it, and they needed to bring everything together. So if we just move on to that next slide, we've got a little kind of visual illustration of what they were trying to achieve at Ericsson, which was to have these kind of automated, what they called single domain, single application development and delivery processes, until they get to a point where they're confident in the quality and the state of the code in each of those different applications. And then they wanted to bring it together to do what they call multi-domain testing, integrated testing, before deploying in a coordinated way, again, as James has mentioned, because of those dependencies across applications, not just within SAP, into their production environment. So we've got a little kind of diagram of high level how that's working, which we'll take a quick look at now. A couple of builds in here, so we'll look at this step by step. But as you can see, at the time, Ericsson were using CA Agile Central, what used to be called Rally, to manage their business requirements, their user stories, and they were using GitLab to manage their central CI/CD pipeline across these different applications. And of course, they were doing some different distributed Git-based development for other applications outside SAP. So when they had a business requirement that had an SAP component, that would automatically be registered via GitLab into Active Control, where this thing called a business task is created that effectively is Active Control's way of registering a requirement or a user story. And that would give the developers the ability to kick off and start working on that in SAP. And as they do their work, run their unit tests, do their peer reviews, and so on, that information will be registered in Active Control and reflected back through GitLab to get that central vision and central source of truth. And once that gets to a stage that it's complete and ready to go, that could then be triggered as a deployment to QA from GitLab. So GitLab would initiate that process. And before that even happened, before any kind of deployment happened, there would be a validation of what's registered in Active Control using that task ID, that information from Agile Central, to check that it's a valid business requirement that the deployment is being requested for. And once that comes back positive and the AOK is there, GitLab will send that deployment trigger through Active Control, which will automatically deploy those changes then into the SAP QA system. And when that happens, a deployment status will be returned through Active Control to GitLab. So as we're doing this, we're getting the maximum visibility in a central place of change across different applications. Again, not just within SAP as a kind of an island. So we've done that. We're happy. We're going to do our testing in the QA system. So that would be the next step in this process. If you just take us on one, James, there we can see that there'll be across those applications automated or different kinds of testing. Some manual testing potentially will be triggered, but however it's done, those results are registered in Active Control and again visible in GitLab or accessible through GitLab via Active Control. And once we're happy with the testing and those changes have passed, again through GitLab, it's possible to trigger a deployment into the integrated test environment. And the important thing here, which is exactly what James was talking about in his generic diagram, is that there's the capability there, because everything's managed from a central point, to deploy to those different applications, including SAP, at the same time and manage that deployment in a coordinated way. So we deploy our changes to this multi-application, multi-domain environment, and again, that deployment status is recorded, so it's all transparent. And if we click on that one more stage, again, we can run our tests and coordinate our tests from a central point. And this is what Ericsson were doing. And of course, once they are happy with the full integration test and that everything is working together, then when it's time to deploy the SAP changes into the SAP production environment, of course, Active Control is taking care of that for Ericsson with all the rigor that James has talked about, as GitLab pushes those other changes into other applications. There are many other tools in Ericsson's pipeline as well related to that CICD process, but GitLab is that central one, and that's communicating with SAP with active control in the SAP instance. So just to summarize that, what did Ericsson see as these kind of outcomes? Well, as clearly they've used active control to help them bring a more DevOps approach and bring a CICD approach into SAP and match up with what they're doing in their other applications. One of the things that active control has also helped them to do, which we haven't really talked about today, is to employ more parallel development so that we can have more agile development going on at the same time. And active control is helping Ericsson to bring those changes together and merge them together as concurrent developments are happening, given that in their case they don't have any kind of Git-based distributed development option for SAP. So at one point you can see Ericsson had N+10 in an extreme case that they were running and coordinating with active control. So with this process, with this new automation, they were able to integrate active control into that cross-application delivery pipeline and really have, when we say on-demand delivery of change, deployment of SAP change, as we said, as soon as it's ready, that continuous delivery idea, as soon as they're ready to approve that and put that into production. And overall, that kind of approach across applications is giving them a faster response to their business and to their customers externally. So as I said, there's a case study you can download from our website if you're more interested in the Ericsson story, but I think a really nice example of how CICD concepts can work within SAP. And again, echoing back to the start of the presentation, why are people doing this kind of thing? We saw some of the high level CICD stats there. These are the kind of numbers that we see amongst Basis Technologies customers when they're employing automation into their change and release process and potentially going to these kind of CICD processes. So we're talking about a lot lower cost, greater efficiency, more speed, less risk, those kind of things that we talked about at the top of the presentation we see reflected in SAP. So just to wrap things up, we're just very slightly over time, but we've looked today at the fact that CICD is a way to automate all the elements of build, test, and deployment in the software development process, but that CICD in SAP, as in so many other things, isn't quite the same as it is elsewhere, specifically mainly for some architectural and technical reasons in this case, so that you need the right automation tooling to make CICD happen in SAP, but we can achieve that, and with it we can integrate SAP into those cross-application pipelines that James was talking about and we saw in the Ericsson example. And CICD and DevOps are enabling IT teams and SAP teams to respond faster and support greater business agility in their working environment today. So that brings us to the end of today's presentation. We'll just take a look at some Q&A in a second, but in the meantime, I just want to thank James for doing his part of today's presentation and to everybody for joining us. If you're interested in these topics and you'd like more information, of course, there's lots more details on the Basis Technologies website, or you can get in touch with us using the details on the screen. You can see the web address there and James's email if you'd like to contact him directly to follow up. As I mentioned at the start, it's a recorded session. We will be sending the link out very shortly, probably in a day or two, if you want to look back at any of the content from today. But in the meantime, thanks very much for joining us. So very quickly, because as I said, we're just up to time. Let's have a quick look at a couple of these questions, James, because a couple of interesting things come in. I think maybe good to clarify. Let's start with, I think this one comes up quite often. Basically, to paraphrase, isn't this just using a bunch of existing tools? So why do we need that extra change orchestrator? Why do we need a CICD tool if we're using tools that are already there?
Well, I think that there's a lot more to it. So it is certainly, we want to utilize the tools that already exist in the ABAP workbench, things like ABAP Unit and Code Inspector and ABAP Test Cockpit and all of these other great tools that have already been provided by SAP. But really, this is a layer on top of that, some additional functionality on that, but also that ability to integrate all of those tools together in an automated pipeline, so that we know that these things have been done. So as a developer, I don't have to go to Code Inspector and run a code inspection. I don't have to go to ABAP unit and run my ABAP unit tests, and that I know that those are going to be automatically run as part of this end-to-end process. So yes, we certainly want to utilize those tools that already exist, but we want to build on top of them as well to get automated dependency checking and automated sequencing of transports and automated impact assessments, etc.
Cool. Okay, thank you. We've got another one here that it's again, just to paraphrase or shorten a little. Can we say that CI/CD processes go best with agile methodology, but not so much with waterfall? Is that fair, or is actually maybe there's more of a middle ground there? Do you think?
Well, I think I mean, if you want to look at CI/CD in its purest sense, then yes, really it goes along with an agile development methodology. In that, the whole idea of CI/CD is that we're looking to automate this end-to-end process. But having said that, as you quite rightly sort of intimate there, Pete, all of these checks and all this automation is just as useful in a waterfall type environment as it is in an agile or DevOps type of environment. And so, essentially, you then have that ability that if you have a SAP Change Orchestrator, like Active Control, that gives you that ability to get a lot of that value now, even if you're still using waterfall development methodologies. But as you then move to much more agile development and then further on to DevOps, then you have the tooling that can move with you and has the ability to move with you as you go through that journey in your organization.
Okay, thanks for that. A very straightforward one here, and we'll just do a couple more before we wrap up. What other tools can Active Control connect to? You mentioned a couple. We had GitLab on the screen. Can you give us a bit more color to that?
Well, there's a whole list of them. I mean, most of our customers, well, the major ones that we tend to see at customer sites are things like ServiceNow, Jira, Azure DevOps, Jenkins, GitLab. These are the sorts of tools which we see all the time that our customers want to integrate with. But Active Control can integrate with essentially with any third-party software. We're using REST-based APIs for integration, and whether you want that integration to go through middleware that you as an organization currently have, that's great. Or you want to use something that's a bit more open, something like Node-RED, where we have a whole bunch of integration templates that we've developed to help organizations integrate Active Control with their other applications, then that's all possible.
Okay, thanks for that. I think just one related one I'd like to cover to that, because I think it's very interesting. We talked about the idea of Git-based development outside of SAP, and we haven't touched on the topic of ABAP Git, which is something that a lot of our customers are just looking at, maybe investigating, considering for the idea of distributed development. How does ABAP Git, somebody who's seen our ABAP Git demonstration that we have on our website is asking how that fits into this picture, and does that fit into this picture?
It absolutely does, because when you're looking at Git-based development processes, you're actually looking at the development process itself, not necessarily all of those processes that happen after the development is initially complete. So there's a lot of compatibility between things like ABAP Git and Active Control to manage that change through that whole development and deployment lifecycle. So as you have mentioned, we have quite a lot of content on our website around ABAP Git and how it can be used in a SAP sort of development process alongside with Active Control, so that you get the best of both worlds. You get that ability to do distributed development, but then you still get that automation and that rigor that Active Control can give you when it comes to ensuring the checks are done and the deployments are orchestrated and so forth and so forth. So I mean, obviously it's a full topic in its own right, and we do have webinars on ABAP Git and its use. So if people are interested in that, I would encourage them to go onto the website and have a look at some of those webinars.
Okay, well, let's just wrap this up with a very basis technologies focused question. Someone is asking whether all of the steps, everything you've described in that process comes out the box with Active Control, if it can supply all that functionality.
Since we're tight on time, I'll just give the short answer, and the short answer is yes.
Okay, very good. Well, once again, we're nearly up to the hour. We've gone on slightly longer than planned, but I think some really useful answers and information there, James. Thank you again to everybody for joining us today, and we hope to see you soon on another Basis Technologies webinar.
Thanks for your time, everyone.